This video is sponsored by Knuckles OX. Hello everyone, and welcome to the What If SuperMini movie of my shorts for 2024. I did this last year and it worked well as both a nice compilation video to upload in the early months of the year, when YouTube is just very slow and muggy to work with, and it helps keep track of shorts, because so many pile up year after year, and I don't expand on every SuperMini concept like I did for say my What If the Z Fighters Became Android series of shorts, which you should also check out after this, since I went ahead and left the parts of the story which were made in 2024 out of the comp. And that said, these compilations also make it a bit easier to give shorts and SuperMini concepts a second chance at getting enough popularity with you guys to maybe try and expand them a little bit more to fuller concepts. Don't worry about hearing from me for a sign out at the end, but thanks for the views if you make it that far. If you don't mind, drop me a like and comment your favorite short of the year, and without further ado, please enjoy the shorts of 2024. If Bakugo kept One for All, it would take the story into an irrevocably different direction to the one it has canonically taken as we move closer and closer to that series finale, as this will make the events of Heroes Rising and their consequences all completely undeniably canon. This would also see One for All not conveniently return to Deku, rather leaving him with albeit powerful, but still fleeting embers of the ability, while Bakugo is meanwhile supercharged to the powers of All Might he's always craved, but at a steep cost he will soon come to learn, when meeting the past users and relaying what he knows to All Might Deku. With the cost for being the 10th quirk holding user being fairly steep, there is an instant incentive for Bakugo to part ways with the power stockpiling ability, though as giving it to another quirk holder would only be passing the buck off, a quirk which becomes more necessary for Bakugo's survival than ever before. Though ironically, Deku may well not be an eligible candidate any longer, not because his body is unable to re-accept One for All, but because in the defeat of Nine, as the Zuko of this verse seems to have accidentally stolen his duplicated but weakened quirk factor for All for One, leaving our two heroes in an extremely confusing and dangerous situation with new abilities that could easily backfire in horrible ways to doom either themselves or all of superhuman society. If Yuga Aoyama was actually evil and embraced his role as the UA traitor is interesting to me because it may be one of the best examples of how strong ideas for alternate timelines you can find in the My Hero series are, if you just open your mind a little from the context of giving Deku a different power, or making the story something around the Todoroki family. As All for One's unwilling mole, Aoyama already serves as a major player that shapes the story from the background anyway, and in the end, his motivation to initially just save himself and his family is sound enough that eventual corruption would still fit into the series' themes of true villainy occurring only when we try to cast our pain onto others. Beyond this, getting a more fitting quirk from All for One in exchange for more cooperative and cunning services to sabotage the heroes would be more than enticing, and with the Demon Lord of Villains basically being able to all but tailor-make quirk cocktails, or seemingly brand new quirks in total for his subordinates, Aoyama could easily wind up with an even more fitting quirk, giving him power that puts him into the higher ranks of the UA hierarchy, and makes him more capable of carrying out his dark mission. If Deku got New Order, it would likely come as a result of a combination of luck, fate, plotting between master and disciple, and a certainly last-minute and downright broken quirk awakening. Stars stem the canon story, while Brief already holds profound impact in setting the major stakes, timing, and themes for the final clash between the forces of the heroes and villains, as well as helping to hamper Shigaraki temporarily. So an extension of this could easily come in the form of a mad scheme between her and All Might to not only put her life on the line to kill or cripple the Villain King, but also to try and compound her power into One for All, as if she could possibly just evolve her quirk one final time to allow for one extra rule. She could order a fragment of her power to go to and harmonize with Izuku Midoriya and One for All, after Shigi leaves to rid himself of the stolen parts that are destroying him, so that even if Star does fall, it truly is not in vain, as even if it allows Deku to only inherit a small part of her quirk factor, along with her will, it's worth it. If it means he can make at least one rule of his own to change the final battle in his favor, it could quite possibly create a new order in this timeline, where we only have to say good riddance to All for One, but not a farewell to One for All. If instead of simply supplanting his powers onto Deku, what if one of Man of Action's young protagonists, Rex Salazar, was in the world of My Hero Academia himself instead? Having tried the prior version before, I would say from experience that I think you'd end up with a more interesting execution of the topic, and in addition to the cast and its lore as well as an opportunity to squander less of Rex's lore and cast. The Nanite virus itself and quirks could coexist in a shared lore, with some finagling, but it's a similar issue as what came up for the creators, who wanted to cross Rex over with characters like Ben Tennyson or Zack Saturday more often, since their universe and lore requires a bit of freedom from nanites and evos. Thus, My Hero and its quirks actually provide a staging ground to do all this alongside a greater narrative IMO. The way I would go about this is heavily utilizing Van Kleist and Rex's parents' research and just tweaking it a bit to be research on quirks and possible ways to regulate, amplify, or nullify their growth, in regards and recognition to things like the quirk singularity theory, the trigger drug, and in light of figures like All for One in the world. From there, I would isolate the nanite event to a specific area. To stay on brand, it would likely be a specific real-world country, or at most, a landmass as big as a continent. So Mexico or a large portion of South America, for example. Making it a place in the My Hero Academia universe that still follows its rules, but has an extra tightrope to walk, of the place being ground zero for an infection of nanites, which we'd later come to realize are Van Kleist's original quirk, souped up and amplified beyond belief, after his greed and power lust drove him to selfishly take the results of his and the Salazar's research all for himself. Meanwhile, in response to this, the government of whatever country this is occurring in is forced to isolate their country and try to deal with the growing abscess and corruption from the nanites on their own, as Van Kleist and his pack try to form an army of evolved quirk wielders, also known as Evos, through terror and experimentation. As such, a brand new elite hero school devoted solely to solving this issue would be formed, Providence High, where our hero Rex would be enrolled through a mysterious recommendation no one seems to understand, alongside his own cast of supporting characters and mentors, including figures like Doc Holliday, Agent 6, White and Black Knight, Noah, and of course Bobo, with things like studies, fill-in and Evo attacks, and drama such as a fellow student Rex develops a crush on named Cersei, actually turning out to be a spy/plant for the pack, on top of hiding the fact that Rex seems to have mutated an extra quirk ability, one very like Van Kleist's, and what's more, he has already somehow suffered and become immune to nanite infection. Instead, the prowess of his creation-based quirk, not unlike Creades, was only greatly enhanced, though there is a drawback like with most quirks. If Rex overheats or loses focus on all the internal engineering and calculations it takes to make his powerful builds, he can be overwhelmed by his own nanites and thrown into a state of berserk rampaging, just like any other regular wild or powerful Evo. However, by the time the main story of My Hero Academia begins, I believe Rex would have already solved these problems, saved his country from the nanites, and would be well on the way to climb the international hero billboards, and possibly even tipping the scales in the war for Japan. I've tried this idea once in one way, and it would take a lot of art to do it in this way as well, but I really look forward to trying this as a mainline story someday, as this was only a short exploring what would happen. If Sabito had survived and gone on to become a Hashira alongside Gyu, it would more than likely be as a result of the actions of Oroku Daki more than anyone else, as after the loss of Makomo, his grief could see him either prepare both boys, specifically Gyu, better, or perhaps even delay their final selection. A good reason for this could lie in the old water swordsman perhaps making a strict goal of fully bringing Sabito's water breathing to a higher level of mastery, and encouraging and developing on Gyu's naturally more defensive style of it, to possibly create a new breathing form all his own, with this fueling Oroku Daki to push both boys harder, and hold them to higher standards. If this were to be the case, and the moment when Sabito goes on ahead while Gyu begins to pass out, he would instead awaken early, concentrating his breathing, and joining his brother in arms in a battle against the Hand Demon, their increased power combined being enough to overcome it, not just thanks to the constant flux of a more confident water Hashira in the making of the likes of Sabito, but also due to Gyu discovering Tempest Breathing, and this moment going on to turn his custom 11th form of water breathing into the first form of this new technique, as he and Sabito now represent a much more powerful asset to the Demon Slayer core, with blades that reflect both the vastness and fluidity of the ocean, and the terror and destruction of the storms it brews. If Makomo had survived her final selection and defeated the Hand Demon, I think she would have easily had the opportunity to carry out Master Oroku Daki's will fully, and establish his schooling as easily the most functional and well balanced of the ones we're shown in the core, as well as possibly changing it as we know it. Keep in mind that Makomo was actually Sabito's senior, and died before he and Gyu even arrived to train, so she would find herself a contemporary to swordsman that would later go on to be Hashira, and much like if Gyu and Sabito had grown to full potential, I fully believe she could as well. Thus again, much like with Sabito surviving, this would give us a different water Hashira, which could technically improve her junior swordsmanship, or even influence them into different breathing styles, to continue diversifying the art form, increasing the chances to rid the world of demons, maybe seeing a boil or steam breathing for Sabito, and either ice or my formerly proposed tempest breathing for Gyu, easily making it possible to buy us 2 extra Hashira, which could lead to other characters' fates being changed, and easily a swifter end to Muzan, as a Tanjiro able to rely on Makomo and Sabito as senior Hashira rather than solely on Gyu, would quickly begin to outdo its canon self. Plus, I would just like to see Makomo paired up and fighting alongside some of the other Hashira, like Shinobu. If Merleona Vermilion trained her little cousin Noelle Silva early, it would first and foremost likely be as a result of Merleo's respect for Aesir, as well as a greater disdain for how petty, vain, and cold House Silva would become after her death. As a result, in this timeline, Merleo would more firmly try to establish herself as a big sister figure for Noelle, just like she is for her actual brothers, doing her best to help, stand up for, and be around for the younger mage, as much as she's reasonably able to, alongside her goal of toughening Noelle up and surpassing her mother, which could also see Nozel and the rest of the Silva loosen up a bit more, just like the Vermilions have, or hopefully even get closer to their estranged family. For Noelle specifically, this would also make her easily one of the most recognized and well-developed gifted mages of her generation, which would be funny because she would also be a lot more assertive on top of her usual high and mightiness when the story starts. What's more, when the time comes, she'd likely have her pick of Magic Knight squads to join, which could endanger her place in the Black Bulls in this timeline, as joining the Golden Dawn with Yuno would make a lot more sense for how strong she'd likely be. However, considering Merleona would only encourage Noelle to be more of a free spirit than Aesir was, she could turn down requests from better squads for the challenge and intrigue of joining the quote-unquote worst one. If Yoichi Isuki had devoured Ryosuke Kira, as he would later due to the likes of all his rivals he recognizes and respects the ego and ability of, it could change the story of Blue Lock as we know it quite drastically. Consider this would likely see the Saitama Prefectural Finals we meet Isagi in would be a lot more competitive, as even if Isuki doesn't discover and take more pride in his natural weapons of spatial awareness, positioning, and tactics early, if he just gets hyped up enough to lead his team against Kira, it'd likely still change a great deal of things within him, which would lead to an earlier awakening or evolution, as even Kira cited being impressed with Isuki beforehand. This would also just entail Kira actually showing off and probably discovering a lot more skill, rather than us simply hearing of it. The game could still end up going either way, but both strikers would walk away completely changed, before they even get their invitation to Blue Lock. As per their characters' personalities and beliefs though, I think both would decide to participate still, bringing our next big change out of the entrance exam tag game, as Isuki may lose interest in going after Kira, or he may challenge someone else. In the end, I think Kira will be the second to last to be it, seeing Ego's words come true, as fighting to the end, Kira strikes either Kuon, Imamura, or Ikaguri out as a result, likely giving Team Z a much more fortified roster, which can elicit chemical reactions from the start. If the council denied Obi-Wan the right to train Anakin, and therefore betrayed both the dying wish of his master and him in the process, it would have a massive impact on both them and the Star Wars galaxy as a whole, since from Obi-Wan's history with Satine, we know that he is willing to leave the Jedi Order. Considering he gave Qui-Gon his word on his deathbed that he would train Anakin, I believe it is likely he would leave the Order at this point, train Anakin not as a Jedi, but in the ways of the living Force, with this giving him a more historic view of the Force, while helping Obi-Wan himself to deprogram some of the Jedi's dogma and see the galaxy for what it truly is. Because of this, Palpatine will remain loyal to Dooku, meaning a probable separatist victory in the Clone Wars, with this leading to the exile, or more likely extermination of the Jedi, and the reformation of the galaxy into an empire. However, as always, a spark of hope would remain, this time in two Force users outside the Order, with Anakin and Obi-Wan being instrumental in the formation of a rebellion and eventually an order that could truly bring balance to the Force. If Osolo had trained Ren is a question that came up for me while reading the events of the current battle against Satan arc, and seeing how well the two got along, as well as just how curious Ren was about Osolo's knowledge on talismanic foods, since we learned that he apparently runs an entire workshop on them. So an alternate timeline where Father Fujimoto took Ren and Yukio to one of these workshops in the past honestly isn't extremely out of the question, especially if it isn't strictly taught to exorcists. If not done by that route, and instead through Shiro having early revealed the truth to Ren, it could still lead to large changes. Osolo in a major way is the only reason Lightning turned out not to be a complete psychopath, so that's another feather in his cap as a mentor for difficult students. And his rank as Arc-Knight, a unique way of using the skills of the Tamer class, could also vastly increase the threat Ren imposes, and hasten the mastery of his power, as it likely lead to his having a higher affinity for gathering familiars. And I could even see him doing so a lot like how he did Kuro, with the bonding through food as well. There's still a bit in Osolo's backstory I hope to see expanded on in the anime, like his marriage, but otherwise, these are only a few reasons why I'm curious about if Grey Fullbuster was an Ice Dragon Slayer, rather than an Ice Make, an Ice Devil Slayer wizard. I think it could still be an interesting opportunity to explore different aspects and outcomes in the world of Fairy Tail, even if it would result in less diversity from our main cast. And I also think there are ways to address that issue in other ones, and fun ways of going about the concept, and we don't really lose out on much in terms of basic power scaling, since Grey is presented as being formidable even amongst powerful Slayer wizards from the moment we meet him, just kinda in his base form as Natsu's first rival and brother in the guild. For instance of some of the intrigue, there's so much that can be done with Grey's backstory with Delior on its own, such as the newly orphaned Grey being found by an ice dragon named something like Glaciera, whom much like Orwin in canon senses his potential in grief, taking him in, adopting him, and promising to train and prepare Grey to take on the demon from the Book of Zeref which did this to him. Since with that decision alone, you change a lot for Or, Leon, and Ultir's backstories as well. You of course then also have the pretty much instant intrigue in the concept of Grey still making his way to Fairy Tail eventually, when Glaciera mysteriously disappears one day, and not long after that, Grey's meeting with Natsu, and even Loxus, whom Grey in this timeline may even be able to sense something of interest about, since he's a bit more perceptive about some things. Regardless, the rivalry between this Natsu and Grey would be a lot fiercer, but so would their bond, since they would reluctantly have a lot more in common in this verse, other than just their loyalty to one another as guildmates. Speaking of rivalries between Dragon Slayers, Gajo here presents another interesting concept, since it's also highly possible this version of Grey could find himself joining up with Phantom Lord instead, where a similar bond could be established with people like Gajo and Juvia, or maybe Gajo could find himself swapping places with Grey, if the guild is too small for one Dragon Slayer, that is. There is also of course the less interesting route of Grey becoming a second generation Dragon Slayer whose powers come from an Ice Dragon Slayer Lacrima implanted in his body, which could be done in a myriad of ways, even in canon honestly if Mashima so decided it, though no matter how we freeze this, it would likely result in a more powerful and stacked roster for the Fairy Tail Guild at the end of the day, since I kinda find that's the outcome for most stories in the verse that aren't overtly what if the bad guy won concepts. Before we end this Super Mini off, however, I do want to quickly quickly note one concept for a SuperMini in the future that I'll likely adapt someday, as a kind of sister concept / part 0 in a way, linking it to this one since they feel somewhat intrinsically tied together in at least their concept. What if Delio turned good and raised Grey akin to the way Dragon Slayers are adopted and raised? Or just what if Delio raised Grey, dropped the turning good part? Before I would do this, I still desperately need to finish up my read-through of the series to tie some of the later lore and plot twists that would be relevant in this kind of story, like Silver and his backstory for example. But I do think there's enough meat on that bone for some expansion, possibly even combined with Ice Dragon Slayer Grey Fullbuster for a bigger story, as I think both make for great alternate universes in Fairy Tail, which the series is no stranger to after all. Though I do want to know, is this concept too redundant or unoriginal to you, or would you be interested in a more thoughtful and narrativized story for if Urza had somehow found the aid or magic power to defeat Jalal, destroy the Tower of Heaven, and save their friends early? It's quite interesting, since this alternate timeline would change so many other backstories, and would likely see the ranks of Fairy Tail beefed up a bit earlier as well. For example, this would probably require taking on a young Ulti, which could in turn bring earlier conflict with the forces of Grimoire Heart as well. That said, one extremely fitting way this could happen is through Grandpa Rob not losing his magic, which could allow him to help in the battle and lead Urza and her friends back to Fairy Tail, or even stay back at the crumbling tower in order to hold off any tenacious pursuers, if his sacrifice must be maintained, that is. This would also mean that despite having a lot of variable styles formed, Urza would likely already have her own team within Fairy Tail pretty early on, which would in turn cause some bigger changes and rivalries within the guild. Because of the likes of Sho, Miliana, Wally, and Simon, it'd likely be one of the strongest teams in Fairy Tail's history, and by proxy would cause more ambitious characters like the Strausses, Kana, Natsu, Grey, and Loxus to get stronger to keep up. Jalal, however, will be a point of interest, as part of me feels some of his awkwardness and other traits would still be present, despite not having all that much to atone for. Much like the question of Smokey awakening to the power of Hamon, giving him a stand is an immensely interesting scenario, because it's empowering a Jobro, or just a general ally of the good guys, who canonically couldn't contribute in battle or dangerous situations in general. It would also be versatile, because you certainly have the option to hold off on that, and do this in part 3 with Mayor Smokey, but Kid Smokey getting a stand before anyone else in battle tendency is a bit more fun. And since it would technically be in the same generation, to use a bizarre word, as Hermit Purple, it could manifest like it, a lot more subtly than the typical stands of the more modern era that Jotaro and the resurrected Dio would head up. And considering the inspos for his names in Jackie Robinson and James Brown, the stand could just be an unassuming cloud of fog or smoke, which he initially mistakes as a Hamon ability, which upon learning how to better use, is mostly best for support, like hiding allies, and blinding or tracking enemies, so that when it is fully mastered, he decides to call it just to see funk, with this ability allowing him to pitch in and help cut down on some of the casualties incurred in part 2. And best of all, he still have the option to later return as Stardust Crusader, and possibly even more experienced stand users than Abdal. If Arena unlocked Hamon, she could change the bizarre adventure as a whole long after Hamon stopped being a factor. Arena is not very confrontational in her younger days, and what's more, her passion lies in the field of medicine, but even so, if she had the power to help Jonathan with his grand responsibility, she surely would. Though that very mindset applied through Hamon could be just what's needed to keep our pioneer Jobros all alive and well. Seeing Baron Zeppeli join the ranks of the final battle against Dio, along with Arena as the group's white mage, able to resonate with Jonathan. With the deck so stacked, Dio wouldn't get a chance to escape until was given a final chance at mercy by his adopted brother and sister-in-law. Atone now, or after they have tried to find a way to reverse his vampirism. If this were to be the case, part 2 would be rather interesting, since Lisa has no need to be adopted, and George II may survive on account of his parents in Dio's presence, as an at first unwilling, but eventually loyal to Arena Alucard-like figure, who later serves as the greater mentor and leader to versions of Joseph and Caesar trained by their grandfathers against the Pillar Men. Not to mention, Arena as a nurse could see practicality in trying to pass on any kind of Hamon healing technique she invents, helping allies like the Speedwagon Foundation be better equipped against the supernatural. If Smokey Brown somehow unlocked Hamon and joined Joseph Joestar in his adventures and battles against the Pillar Men permanently, it would have pretty much been an undeniably more interesting use of his character rather than just him chilling out with Granny Arena and then going on to become a politician. Beyond this, had he actually joined up for training under Lisa, we could have gotten a much more traditional shonen battle manga trio of heroes alongside a wise mentor in the likes of Lisa. Smokey would also be an interesting addition because he would have little to no natural talent in Hamon, making him the weak link, but also likely the true heart of the team, since all the while he would also be a fighter whose battle tendencies are also being coached by Jojo and Caesar while they're also working up themselves, keeping them as a whole group a lot more close-knit, and making it so it's a lot easier for them to work together, so much so that Caesar may even see himself surviving with this timeline. And his further impact can enable things like Smokey's learning to use Hamon to affect an element like Caesar and Jojo's grandfather could, or maybe even by having the young pickpocket use his thievery and sleight of hand skills in near-perfect synchronicity with Joseph, which could possibly make them the strongest duo to ever exist, simply because they could probably just make their opponents believe so. And none of this is touching on what could happen if Smokey became a Stardust Crusader. If Impmon was Staccato's partner instead of Guilmon, it changed the entire scope of Digimon Terrence fairly drastically in my opinion, since first of all, this would necessitate that Staccato in the lore creates Impmon, who is already an established species originally. It also means that if Guilmon and Impmon are swapping places totally, that Guilmon would then be Ai and Mako's partner, which based on how optimistic you are, could either turn out badly or better than it did for Impmon. especially if the two retain their usual personalities. For example, Takato and Rika would likely have a much more classic rivalry, since this Takato could be a bit more brash. However, in the end, I think this would result in them getting closer with her and Renamon to get them on their side far sooner. That said, between each other, Impmon and Gilmon aren't that different, so Impmon would still likely partner well with Takato, especially when accessing the power of new forms like Punk and Loudmon made by Takato, while Heavy Metal Drummon would still appear as a Dark Digivolution to contrast Gilmon and the eventual Megidramon if he were to run away from his tamers. But ultimately, Takato and Impmon would biomerge into Beelzemon and use his higher level forms and decisive power as the Demon Lord of Gluttony to handle the issues of Hypnos, the digital world, the Devas, and D-Reaper far before they can hurt their friends. What if Ash woke up one time is perhaps the best well-known and most popular Pokemon what if, though the question of why is perhaps just as, if not more interesting. Through some analysis, I believe it boils down to a couple of key factors. First, it is a canon what if, and one posed almost immediately in the very beginning of the Pokemon anime, through how much emphasis the first episode puts on Ash sleeping in and its impact on his journey. This, I believe, feeds into the second reason, which is that due to it changing the very foundation of Ash's journey, it can be used to justify massive changes from the get-go, while on the other hand, not necessitating it, making it equally valid to stay very close to canon aside from the obvious tweaks of Ash's starter, which even in and of itself is open to interpretation as to which one he gets. Finally, I believe this story concept appeals to people because of its connection to nostalgia, and stands as a greater power fantasy, not only because it is tied to the iconic Indigo League arc of the anime, which for many fans is where they first got introduced to Ash for all his faults and strengths, but also because for many, this was their first experience with Pokemon what ifs, and possibly would inspire them to start making their own in the first place. Naturally, there are many other factors, though I believe these are the main three reasons why. If Ash kept Primate full-time rather than only calling it back for pictures, I would recognize some of the extremely salient points my buddy Mr. Gumbrion made in his take on the concept, though I would take the route of disagreeing starkly with the impact the Pigmonkey could have. As IMO, not only is there a strong argument every one of Ash's Kanto catches was fundamental to the trainer he turned out to be for better or worse, from Butterfree down to every single Tauros, but also because a relatively loyal and tame powerhouse like Primate on his team for longer so early on could really have positive impact on not just his entire team's overall strength, but specifically for Pokemon like Charizard, who seek to constantly better themselves and reach higher heights due to a fiery fighting spirit, or even later down the line towards the development of Infernape, since he'd have extra experience raising a fighting type, and one with an extremely blazing temper and a great deal of untapped potential at that. With DP being a season already set up for Ash to be hyper competent and calling his older mons for help more often when he really needs it. As for the possibility of achieving the Annihilate form, as it came when Ash was leaving the story, it's likely he and Primate could either miss out on it or get the opportunity to show it off as a teaser for what's to come, especially should the concept of journeys be impacted by this already more elite Ash. If Brock raised Ash is interesting for multiple reasons. First and foremost, because it will be a scenario where there are multiversal echoes, ones that allow us to see a world where Ash and Brock's bond, that is so often interpreted as a super patient and loving brotherly one, can be expanded on into much more of a rock-solid foundation for Ash, if you will. There is also the intrigue of the change of goals an Ash like this could face, since depending on how he's inducted into Brock's family, he could either feel a drive to become a rock-type specialist himself, in order to free Brock in the position of gym leader, allowing him to go out and achieve his true goal of becoming a Pokemon breeder. Ash could even not change at all, and still desire the title of a Pokemon master, and therefore not even limit himself to a single type, even though he may obtain a great appreciation and understanding for it. Finally, there's the intrigue of Ash's starter in such a verse, as more than likely, it would be fitting of the pewter gem, so the rock type is to be expected. And while Ash in canon has both caught and encountered a few rock types of note, many of which would be great in the starter role, and I don't know a true best option, as we have great picks like Rockruff, Roggenrola, Rhyhorn, as the only other dual rock and ground type of Kanto Brock doesn't actually use obviously, and maybe even a Alolan Geodude, or even a real Dark Horse, and some kind of immature and freshly revived fossil Pokemon. Though who knows, that may be a better idea to save for if Rourke and Byron from Sinnoh raised Ash. If Misty and the sensational Cerulean City Waterflower sisters raised Ash as their brother, or even just sponsored him as a trainer, it would definitely give us a story with very similar elements, but more than likely following two hot-headed heroes, aspiring to be Pokemon masters. The concept is already interesting because there's a great deal of notable water types Ash canonically has strong connections to, though that can after all be argued to some extent for most types. But from his original choice of starter being Squirtle, to his original Mega Evolution substitute being Greninja, there is also that ever-present issue with this kind of scenario, whether or not Ash himself picks up a strict or even partial water type specialty, or could he simply build teams of Pokemon who love the water despite it not being theirs to command. Beyond that, with his older sister's background and performance, the question of battling or doing the same would also be posed to Ash as it was to Misty, though in this case, when contests are introduced, I'm of the firm opinion that both brother and sister would have a why not both mentality about the question, therefore causing them to quickly train twice as hard and travel twice as far to achieve their ambitions as fast as the sea itself. As for starters and signature ace Pokemon for either Misty or Ash in this story, they're truly countless, as water is the most populated type, though in my opinion, there are some pretty amazing dark horse picks like Krabby, Slowpoke, Weasel, or a baby Lapras. If Lieutenant Surge raised or sponsored Ash Ketchum is interesting already, because of the pre-established connection and short rivalry the two characters share in the canon story already, which despite its brevity, remains one of the most iconic matchups of the original anime. Besides this, there is inherent intrigue in the question because due to Pikachu's place as both Ash's starter, and even ace in some instances, he hails it as his one and only electric type, so seeing what other Pokemon of the typing he'd recruit as Cadet Ketchum is a question with endless interesting answers. And beyond this, there is an incredibly interesting setup with Surge as the mentor, since he still very much fits an antagonistic role, even if he is doing a lot of teaching or life lessons. The vibe we'd be going for is a hard-ass drill sergeant who wants to both instill discipline and bring the best out of the students in his care. One easy way I can see this done is by having Ash's lessons from Surge conflict or swap in an interesting way from when I first suggested this concept to my friend trainer Dina, changing the person who misunderstands strength and size to be everything from Ash as the student to Surge as the master. Maybe even seeing Ash draft some of the other Pika clones onto his team, as the ultimate symbol of this, should he become a type specialist that is. If Erica trained, sponsored, or raised Ash, he would definitely have a preference for the grass type, though fortunately here, Kanto has many great options, such as the Oddish, Bulbasaur, and even Execute lines. However, I do believe his starter will ultimately be a Bellsprout, as a reference to Erica's potential Johtonian heritage as a kimono girl, through the Sprout Tower, which Ash is likely to have visited and trained at before. This would also make Jeanette Fisher a prime rival for this Ash, as their two Bellsprouts could adopt alternate fighting styles, truly allowing them to see whether a good offense is the best defense, or a good defense is the best offense. However, battling would not be this version of Ash's only interest, as thanks to his mentor, whom he possesses a classic responsible big sister and reckless little brother relationship with, he will be far more cultured and well-rounded, enjoying tea ceremonies, flower arranging, Pokemon coordination, and of course, he would love perfume. If playing, as with just about any other fire-type specialist sponsored Ash, it'd be a match made in passionately hellish flames, as his own hot-headed nature, fiery fighting spirit, and dedication to the gospel of the throttle already make him a naturally good fit for a myriad of fire-type Pokemon in canon, some of which he caught and trained to their fullest potential, and others he simply befriended and helped to keep their little lights burning bright, hence it being one of the only types I could see him specializing in, as he already has a name perfect for a fire-type gym leader. Either or, a trainer like Blaine with his scientific mind and focused on well-structured and supported offense would be a great influence on Ash, since he'd help in tempering and teaching him to get the most out of his effort when using all his firepower. And of course, there is tons of interesting supplemental lore like Blaine's connection to Team Rocket, and Mewtwo for added drama if one would like. And best of all, this pseudo-research assistant Ash from Cinnabar Island would likely still form a possibly stronger rivalry with Gary Oak, due to them both taking pride in their knowledgeable mentors, and passionately loving the Growlithe line. Though needless to say, with one being Ash's starter, and this world's Pikachu, Ash would go on to prove his burns a lot hotter, by becoming a fire-type Pokemon master, alongside the puppy Pokemon and his other teammates. If Ash was sponsored by Koga, there are two ways it could go. The first and most obvious is that he could specialize in poison types, like his gym leader mentor, though personally, I believe there is a more interesting specialization for this Ash, and that is Pokemon who exemplify the way of the ninja. While some of these would undeniably be poison type like Venonat, whose compound eyes and antennae are good for surveillance and scouting one's environment before a mission, he would also make use of Pokemon like Shiftry due to its dark typing and stealthy movements, Ninjats for rather obvious reasons, likely along with Ninkata and Shedinja since his low health coupled with Wonder Guard is the exact kind of misdirect shinobi are known for. And finally, Sudowoodo. As the fake log is so heavily associated with ninja iconography, it'd be a crime not to include it for the sake of substitution jutsu. Together, this team of shinobi mons would allow Ash, likely along with his companion Janine, to carry out the benign task of an aspiring trainer by day, while also carrying out missions for their master by night, since in his line of work, to be the very best like no one ever was, means that no one even knows you exist. If Sabrina sponsored or even raised Ash in some way, it'd be a story with both a lot of heart considering the circumstances of Sabrina's origin in the anime, or even Pokemon Adventures, but also one that explores the mystique and power of the psychic type, which the early anime had such a heavy reverence for, as we had impressive showings from the Alakazam line far before Mewtwo made his debut, whereas in this story, Abra would be a viable starter choice. Because of this, we again ask whether the story calls for Ash to be a type specialist or not, which can often mean a change in his goals. But as usual, I lean against it. Starting this Ash off with a Ghastly that is a haunted by the time our story starts proper is simply too fitting from the viewpoint of the multiverse. And Ash being a little brother Sabrina helps with his dreams of becoming a Pokemon master is another somewhat tropey bond I could see a lot of fun characterization for. Aside from the Ghastly line, I think this Ash would have a heavy affinity towards Pokemon which can easily form telepathic links or something close enough. Things with aura abilities like the Riolu, Meanfu, or Togepi line, or unique ability to speak like Chatot, Ninetales, and Slowking, maybe even Mewtwo itself, or even a peculiar Raichu hailing from a different region and bearing the Psych type, becoming this Ash's ace and first challenging Pokemon to train, requiring he and Sabrina journey to meet the Pikahuna, and later travel to the Alola region for the story's second major arc. If it Elite Four member Bruno became Ash's mentor and subsequently raised and/or sponsored him is inherently interesting for more than just the fan theories that the martial artist could be his father on account of the slight resemblance. Raised and trained in the mountains right alongside Bruno and his Pokemon, this Ash would develop a more disciplined and way more battle-focused mindset, while in turn, the wonder, love, and ambition Ash and Deli would introduce changes Bruno as well. Eventually starting with a Machop instead of a Pikachu, Ash would prioritize physical training alongside his Pokemon from the very beginning, just as much as he'd valued a varied and diverse team like Bruno's, learning how to balance power and endurance. His early gym battles and league career would highlight Ash's strategic edge, applying techniques Bruno taught him about overcoming weaknesses, while in turn, spurred on by his student, Bruno and his team may evolve further as well and become champions in their own right, to remind Ash there's always someone stronger out there. As a fun quirk though, I personally believe Ash's Machop wouldn't want to evolve, and would stake its pride on not doing things the easy way, which initially causes tension, as Ash idolizes the power of Machamp far too much. While in turn, I think a Graveler that enjoys the use of its forearms in battle would also be an interesting pick, that maybe sets a trend. Because of his balanced mindset here, if Ash caught a Tyro, it'd surely become a Hitmontop. His can empowerment being caught and kept here in this story would really only make sense, and here, it'd likely go beyond its limits even further. While finally, for at least an initial team, Ash's affinity for the fire and electric types would draw him to a rival pair of Electabuzz and Magmar, whom seemed to take well to the warrior's code, and even delight in training alongside Ash and learning how to turn their simple elemental punches into true full-body elemental fighting styles. So with a squad like this to train with, Bruno's teachings, and whatever friends and companions he makes along the way, since I could also easily see an earlier B rivalry occurring in this timeline, as well as the wide variety of possible regions he could make his start in, from Kanto and Johto, all the way to the more interesting picks like Unova and Galar. This Ash could easily go on to make himself a martial artist Pokemon master with a truly legendary existence, though this is just a short interpretation of. If Dr. Eggman found and raised Tails before Sonic the Hedgehog did, we would likely see a character very similar to Nine from Sonic Prime, as after being mistreated all his life, only to find a father figure who encourages his scientific mind, even more than the Blue Blur usually would in most universes. He would work very hard to please him instead, collaborating with the Doctor in order to optimize his robots, and in the process, heightening his own hyper super genius level robotics and engineering prowess thanks to the resources and support of the Eggman Empire. As a result, Sonic and the heroes would likely have a much harder time due to the new crop of badniks being stronger, and them lacking the assistance of the genius Fox Boy, on whom they so frequently rely on in canon. With this in mind, it is only a matter of time before an Eggman victory is assured, allowing the Doctor to fulfill his dream of creating an Eggman Land theme park, where he and Tails would spend their days cheating at carnival games and cutting in line. The real intrigue here, like with most setups like this, comes in how the two characters can change one another, with a tug of war between their core ideals, as Eggman has recently expanded on a great deal of depth beyond being a mere mustache twirler, and now has even shown that he does possess the qualities of at the very least a decent dad. If Emerald helped Shadow and Maria to escape the Ark, it will be due to the soul Gerald Robotnik gave him overriding his orders to attack, or else because Gerald used his original link to command the Gizzo to save Maria. Due to his sheer destructive power, Emerald would easily be able to dispatch the attacking gun soldiers, meaning Shadow and Maria are able to safely reach a capsule and board it, with Emerald either choosing to stay behind to launch the pod, or finding a way to activate it remotely, as he accompanies them to the surface. Due to not knowing anyone on Earth, Maria would seek out the only other bearer of the Robotnik name, that being her cousin Ivo, who upon hearing what Gun had done would turn his vengeful obsessiveness on them, eschewing all dreams of an Eggman land in favor of justice for their grandfather. This would appeal to Shadow greatly, while Emerald would simply obey whoever he made a new link with following Gerald's death, forcing Maria to stay with them, working tirelessly to ensure that they do not lose their hearts, or forget the noble intentions which had spawned Project Shadow. If Shadow had raised Team Sonic, it would result in a massive shift in the timeline, and more than likely, a very ideal timeline for most involved, even though the scenario may feel a bit redundantly familiar in some ways. For such a setup to happen, the Shadow of this timeline would most likely avoid capture at the hands of Gun, and a 50-year stasis, after escaping the space colony Ark. This would likely make it a little easier for him to hold true to Maria and Dr. Gerald's original intentions for his creation. And speaking of that interest in maintaining a strong link to his origin, and even the inspiration the Doctor took in them, Shadow would wind up making his way to Angel Island eventually, and more precisely, Sky Sanctuary, where he would likely enjoy the solitude and establish a safe home and hideaway for himself, since it's fairly unlikely he'd want to sit idly by forever, and thus would inevitably look for good to do and happiness to protect. Shadow would also go on a good number of adventures, in an era of the Sonicverse we've never seen in-depthly explored in canon, building himself up as a myth, legend, anti-hero, or according to the forces of Gun, a villain, with Shadow spending the next 34 years of his life doing this, until something finally changes. Despite not outwardly showing it, Shadow begins to get old and lonely living this way, and always avoiding others would have also become boring by now, as it's very unlikely anyone could catch him. Certainly it's possible that a misunderstanding could take place so that Ivo Robotnik, Maria's younger cousin, winds up contracted and employed by Gun, all in their desperation to catch Shadow and keep him quiet, resulting in things like a metal shadow android being created. And due to where his home is, he also got chased around by that Echidna tribe once or twice when he got too close to their giant emerald, but it would have been a few decades since he'd seen any of them. and thus, overall, it would just be very hard for the ultimate life form to find himself a challenge, rivalry, or even companionship. And this loneliness would only continue to grow more intense, until one day, he stumbles across a young red echidna, whom he'd quickly come to realize is likely the very last of his kind, and thus, the sole guardian of the echidna ways and the Master Emerald. This event queuing up a chain of sequential events, which would go on to change Shadow's life even further, as in his travels and adventures, he finds two more orphan children, a curious twin-tailed fox, and another hyperactive hedgehog, who could only be described as his polar opposite in everything but talent. Each of the three with endless amounts of untapped potential and possibilities, and so having matured enough to even entertain such notions, Shadow decides to train them, forging them into a powerful team to protect the world, partially because he thinks it will be fun, and also because he has come to miss the family he had on the Ark. Influenced by Shadow's teachings, Sonic retains his love for speed and adventure, but becomes more focused and strategic, learning the importance of discipline and preparation. Tails becomes more confident and independent, embracing his intelligence, and crafting advanced tech, gear, and weaponry to aid the team. Knuckles tempers his hot-headedness, and has better patience and focus with teammates and a master to help guard the Master Emerald, while the act of raising children helps soften and relax Shadow, and thus under his mentorship, Team Sonic becomes a more formidable and cohesive unit. Their personalities and skills evolved, blending their natural talents with Shadow's discipline and combat knowledge and experience. While the team might lose some of its carefree charm, it gains a deeper sense of purpose and strategy, as well as family, viewing Shadow as a father figure and each other as brothers, making them even more effective heroes. Would this stricter version of Team Sonic be as beloved as the original, or would Shadow's influence stifle their individuality? To know exactly, we just may in fact need a longer version of. A viewer requested a scenario, which was essentially what if Sokka, or non-benders in general, could access a separate shonen battle manga-esque form or interpretation of Avatar's chi and bending power system. The example given being having him learn the breathing techniques of Demon Slayer, since they come down to simple martial arts performed at a superhuman level, since that series very interestingly uses the body itself as a power system, hence the viewer's insistence that this makes it sensible for characters outside that verse to learn them. Setting my disagreement aside, I do think this is at the very least an extremely interesting topic that more so touches on if Sokka picked up and devoted himself to swordsmanship earlier. All that would really need to be done for that is either placing admiration for swordsmanship in Sokka's backstory, possibly tied to characters like Hakoda, Han, and Zuko, or working things out so the events of Sokka's master take place ASAP. From there, it's just a matter of Sokka getting to think and experiment to bring out the endless possibilities of the sword, which are meant to act as his equalizers with his friends. Since his options are infinite, he can be an avatar of the blade. He can't earth the water bend, but he can slash at and kick up dirt, or even use his sweat to blind and harm his opponents from far away, and already knows how to avoid damage pretty well like an airbender. So all things considered, I'm kinda wrong. Applying firebending philosophy to focus the empowerment of the breathing on the body could definitely see Sokka pulling off something like Constant Flux, or even Hinokami Kagura. If Toph created metal bending early, it could have an even crazier effect on the world of Avatar than it originally did, moving from the time of the centuries-old war, to the rise of Republic City, and later Avatar Core, to the most extreme degree. I do think it's wholly possible for Toph to make the achievement before joining Team Avatar, as self-admittedly, for a while after achieving her own mastery, she was mostly hiding and squandering her abilities. So working towards another semi-impossibility would highly motivate her, while also tipping off the Beifongs to her true nature. While the reveal of her Earth, and more importantly metal bending abilities, would instantly negate any attempts to capture her name, meaning the wrestlers are defeated instantly, and Toph's departure would likely be done on good terms with her family, therefore putting her in a better headspace as a teammate and teacher, so that Aang himself might even pick up the skill before his successor to become the first metal bending avatar, which in itself could change a lot of the outcomes of the Book of Earth. If this were to be the case, the world's industrial revolution would only be bolstered further, but it would also make a lot of challenges a lot easier, like the Fire Nation drill or just any situation where Toph and Aang's earthbending ability has a major factor on things. That also means Korra would later have Aang's own past memories of learning directly from Toph, meaning she'd pick metal bending up earlier and better, definitely having massive impacts on her books of air, spirit, and change. If Zuko studied other bending styles earlier, he'd far surpass other master firebenders earlier as well. Here, hearing his Uncle Iroh's advice and teachings of the direct correlation to one's bending/martial arts ability and their cultural enrichment, he could sooner make it an active goal at the beginning of his banishment in this timeline. You could even build this from the Netflix version being an Avatar otaku already, because aside from lightning bending, which he won't really be needing until later, there are other applications of other bending styles and philosophies that he also hasn't even tapped into yet, but now would be very aware of. As for example, Admiral Zhao himself adopts a lot of earthbending philosophy into his style, which Zuko canonically countered and defeated with a move that looked a lot like Zuko learned it from Aang, which makes sense, as no other firebender at the time would have extensive experience against an air nomad, and various scrapes of Katara during Aang's Book 1 training would lead to further study of water from budding masters. In the end though, on top of the boost in power and wisdom for Zuko, this would likely see him side with Iroh and join up with Team Avatar by the end of Book 2, meaning instead of a time skip coma, Aang goes into seclusion with 2 firebender masters joining up with Team Avatar, which would also mean better communication with the White Lotus. And if this is the case, the war is ended during the summer, far before Sozin's comet arrives, since now Toph, Katara, and Aang would directly benefit from Zuko and Iroh's presence and teachings. If Katara embraced bloodbending, it would likely be out of a greater recognition of the pain and trauma Hama went through, and how it turned her from victim to abuser, a paradox forming and balancing this forbidden power, as well as the other ruthless but cunning techniques passed down by her fellow Southern Waterbender, all for Katara to now separate into the 2 paths now presenting themselves before her, as Team Avatar prepares for the day of Black Sun. While initially, the forbidden art would seem useless during the eclipse, I'd argue at time when the sun is blocked by the moon, and things of the spirit world probably made a bit wonky, it will be a perfect time for Katara to aggress to, and possibly possibly evolve Hama's bloodbending technique to instead perform Yakone's moonless bloodbending technique, or possibly even Noatak's psychic version, if she were to practice hard enough, that is. As in the face of defeat and separation with her father and comrades again, I think Katara would be fully willing to give in to the hatred that fueled her to nearly take revenge. The largest consequence of this dark, but undeniably justified deed, aside from the Fire Lord likely falling when originally planned, is that Zuko is what would likely be treated as an enemy, unless he too concretely chooses the path of bloodshed and takes his father's head himself to show his allegiance. On paper, returning an era of peace to the world, but in an unbalanced manner. If Aang had fully mastered his airbending before going into the ice and coming out a century later, there are notable amounts of things that could change. Granted, he is already implied to be so near a state of mastery simply by the presence of his tattoos, but you also get the sense he somewhat got them early because there was a push to start his avatar training quickly. So if the time had been taken for Aang to fully realize the potential he could have had as his generation's most powerful airbender, even outside being the avatar as well, this would make him more capable in dealing with and peacefully ending violent encounters to make better time to start on the other elements, and it would also increase his confidence and ability to act as the sagely one of Team Avatar in the early days, since if he matured by a few more years to achieve this before joining the war, it could see him also avoiding some of his mistakes, which could therefore allow him to become a better person and quicker become a fully realized Avatar, able to turn enemies like Zuko and Jet early, as well as maintain the Avatar state and not be incapacitated afterwards. The ultimate culmination of this will be set up for Zahir, and that Aang becomes the first person since Guru Lahima to obtain a state of detachment, while simultaneously balancing his earthly tethers in a way only he could. Love for his friends and people literally lifting him up where he belongs. If Isshin Kurosaki revealed his Shinigami heritage to his progeny earlier, and as a result actively trained Ichigo, Karin, and Yuzu to harness their spiritual powers earlier as well, this change would not only accelerate their development vastly beyond what they experienced in canon, but would also create a powerhouse Kurosaki family, capable of facing threats much tougher than them a lot sooner individually, and especially when gathered together. The catalyst for a change like this would most likely be the death of Masaki, since if Ichigo, even at the age of 9, had a small grasp of some of its potential, he could have gotten away with his mother, or possibly fought or driven Grand Fisher off long enough in order for Isshin or some other form of help to arrive, saving his mother's life in the process. This would by proxy transfer a lot of Ichigo's guilt and mental burdens onto Isshin, as he would likely comfort Ichigo with the knowledge that the tragedy was a failing on his part, and not Ichigo's, revealing the consequences of you have Voxash Fallen, and thus, his children's nature is part Quincy as well. Because of this, a lot of his motivation would be atonement, a battle with a growing overprotectiveness, and overall responsibility, where his inclination is usually to go with the flow and be more relaxed. If you're familiar with my What If Jiraiya Adopted Naruto series, a lot of these themes should sound familiar to you, hence why it is rather tempting to try another version of this story where Masaki does survive. However, I recognize how idealized it could become, as it would almost by necessity start to see the scenario intersect with a few other What If scenarios in the Bleach franchise, just kinda as a direct consequence. For example, the Kurosakis and Shitas probably become a lot closer a lot faster, if not just fully integrating to view one another as family, with Uryu, Ryugen, Kanae, and Soken being able to join in on and benefit from this earlier training and how to utilize Reishi and other spiritual powers. As it would make the most sense to start off simple, Ichigo would first learn basic swordsmanship and combat techniques early, giving him a massive head start, as this is the same basic training that Soul Reapers who grow up in the Soul Society would undergo. If we're in the idealized Masaki alive timeline, this would also likely be a point in which the Ishidas could influence Ichigo's training, since while they are laying low from the Soul Society, Quincy techniques could help Ichigo begin using and controlling his Reishi, while not utilizing an actual Zanpakuto. However, that really depends on how you specifically play things out in either route of taking the scenario. Even if Uryu and the Ishidas are only vaguely aware of Isshin and his machinations of earlier training his family, I think it would cause them to prepare Uryu more intensely as well no matter what. While in the Kurosaki household, when they too come of age to begin their training, Karin would apply her natural spiritual sensitivity and sharp wits to make her a quick learner, specializing in precision attacks and energy-based techniques, like Hado and Kido, and if influenced by her mother the Ishidas, this inclination may push her into the route of becoming a Quincy, while Yuzu, though initially weaker, focuses on defensive and supportive abilities that could push her to awaken as a Fullbringer, not unlike Orihime, developing a unique niche in the family dynamic. As for what would happen when the series starts proper, for now I think things could remain fairly similar, with Isshin being away while instead of a single hollow, as Rukia would have been expected, they are instead overwhelmed and shocked as a Minos Grande suddenly manifests and requires the combined forces of the Shinigami, Ichigo, and his sisters to survive against, culminating in Rukia letting Ichigo borrow her powers to slay the giant hollow, and begin our story in this alternate universe of, if Sappo bonded some more, and in the end joined Kumo for some of his adventures in the time leading up to his seclusion and cyborgification on Egghead, it would give more chances to expand on their short time training together. And based on when it could take place, it could even wind up with Bonnie having a powerful older brother figure, who we later even see that during the raid on Mary Joie, she works relatively well with him. So in this timeline, they'd form a perfect team. At the same time, as interested as Kun became in Luffy, and accounting for his actual willingness to somewhat approach him, unlike Dragon had, this could just as easily result in Sabo regaining his memories as well earlier. Though when you mess around with this character in alternate timelines enough, you learn that that's usually the case. With the timeline diverging here to possibly see the route and goals of the Straw Hats drastically change as the fellow Worst Generation crew, with Sabo as its first mate, approaching, befriending them, and making an offer for an alliance and a great adventure, wanting to team up with the goal of breaking into the government island Egghead in order to kidnap the warlord Bartholomew Kuma and reuniting with his daughter. Honestly, I'd really like to see a full story of this, because a change of the entire route of the story is always welcome. If Arlong turned good, it would likely be due to engaging in more introspection than he otherwise would, as he recognizes that what he is doing to Kokoyashi Village, and Nami specifically, is exactly the same as what the humans he hates have done to his people for centuries, making him no better than them. In an attempt to right his prior wrongs, he would reach out to Jinbei, who would embrace him as a long-lost brother, and allow the Arlong pirates to reintegrate into the Sun Pirates, with Arlong himself as the division commander, traveling the East Blue to improve human-fishman relations. As a part of this reconciliation, he would share the arts of true swimming and fishman karate with Nami, being his most avid student, though this prosperity would likely result in conflict between the Sun Pirates and the Krieg Pirates as the biggest factions in that part of the world. And while a united human-fishman front might be able to handle the Dawn, as is the nature of the world government, Arlong's story would tragically end much like his hero Fisher Tigers, especially if he's not all cozy with the Marines, meaning if Nami meets and seeks Luffy's help, it would be over the body of her shark-toothed father figure, while vowing to map all the world's oceans to prove that it is all the same world for human and fishmen alike. If the Dawn Krieg Pirates, or at least what remained of them, turned good, at least relatively, and joined the Straw Hats, or at least their Grand Fleet, is a genuinely interesting version of the crew introductory villain turning good scenarios to me. Keep in mind that to really tackle Sanji's origin villain rather than his arc villain turning good, you have to actually take on the story of what if Judge turned good, which deserves time all of its own. So Krieg, Gin, and Pearl become the obvious next best choices. What makes this interesting beyond just getting to further involve these characters, which we've been looking out for the reappearances of for so long, a lot more and for a lot longer, especially the likes of Gin, is the fact that this would likely change a lot, and could be rather plausible. Mihawk in this continuity just holds back a smidgen less, and humbles Krieg a lot more. The Armada cut down to just a trio, who are immensely grateful for the food given to them by Sanji. As for a conflict, Mihawk could still rock up to finish them off, while like in live action, Arlong and his crew could attack the Bratier, prompting Krieg, Gin, and Pearl to join forces with the Straw Hats, as they defend the restaurant to pay off their debts. From here, I could see the Krieg Pirates becoming at least some of the first temporary guest characters on the ship, before Vivi and Karu, which would introduce big changes aside from bolstering the crew's strength. Gin, for example, having such similar traits of both Zoro and Sanji almost equally, could probably lead to helping the duo train more actively in preparation for the Grand Line, so that way they can better support their captain and avoid the same mistakes their crew made. Krieg, though his will and ambition may still clash with Luffy somewhat, would have already had his dreams destroyed by someone much stronger, so he may take on a more mentor role to the likes of he and Usopp, whom he would likely bond a lot with, especially since his skills as a military-grade craftsman and strategist would likely far extend the life of the Mary before the crew even meets Frankie, and could make a much more lethal warrior of the sea out of the long-nosed sniper. While on the other hand, a lot of his experiences and failures could be a very valuable perspective for Luffy. Pearl is admittedly a bit more boring of an addition. However, his slight cowardly streak and focus on defense make him a perfect addition to the likes of the weaker Straw Hats. And with a mechanic like armament hockey in the verse, that actually could have some consequences of its own, at least far down the line. In this story, sagas like Alabasta would be extremely interesting, since I could see Krieg wanting a rematch with someone at, or possibly even wanting to reach the warlord level himself before the system is disbanded, giving him his confidence back, and likely bonding with Vivi over some of the concepts of leadership and responsibility he's grown to understand. Eventually after the arc, or maybe a few down the line more, I believe Krieg would be inspired to restart his pirate crew from scratch. However, doing so also as the first official members of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. If Helmeppo turned good early and Zoro wound up training him, probably seems like a very off-the-wall concept at first, but keep in mind, it's primarily meant to be a slight reversal or subversion of the usual way I've done these villains from the Stripe recruitment arcs becoming good and helping the hero scenarios that I've been doing. But also, I think this one could work well because Captain Axe Hand Morgan and Helmeppo really are nowhere near as terrifying or even as villainous as Zoro can be, so it's kind of fitting in that way, but also because Helmeppo is easily the Zoro to Kobe's Luffy, or perhaps the more apt comparison, he's the Bogart to Kobe's Garp. So a power up and some focus in the scenario shouldn't be out of the question. A story like this would probably come as a result of Captain Morgan somewhat turning good in his own right, or maybe just not allowing his son to be such an insufferable brat in his name. Seeing Helmeppo more than likely enrolled into the lowest ranks of the Marines early. As a result, I think his perspective could change a great deal, to where maybe, if Zoro is still captured, he can establish a friendly relationship, or at least an acquaintance. Really, I think think something as simple as Helmeppo practicing sword swings with a mop or broom inside of Zoro could see them strike up a conversation and have Zoro give some tips and pointers to Helmeppo. Or it could be much like how Zoro got his swords back in the live action, which could in turn give Helmeppo some prior experience to his training under Garp, and specifically his swordsmanship training under Bogart alongside Kobe. If he was even able to do well enough, we could see Garp's right-hand man taking Helmeppo fully under his wings when Garp does so with Kobe. Bogart's teachings alongside Zoro's, and a likely one-sided rival with the green-haired swordsman, could see the Kukiri knife-wielding Marine be far more impressive when we meet back up with him after Andy's lobby, and especially when it comes time to save his best friend from the pirate island, Hachinosu, as Helmeppo can now match Kobe's honesty impact with his humility slash. But the real intrigue from a story like this though comes from what changes could take place in the series past where Helmeppo couldn't canonically do or contribute much. How much stronger would he and Kobe be in a timeline like this? And what would they do with or pledge that strength to? If Gaara and Shukaku were never retconned and changed from a boy and the demon or evil sand spirit possessing and torturing him into a Jinchuriki to streamline and normalize a phenomena as something exactly like what Naruto and the others in the world experienced, I definitely think we would have seen a slightly or even drastically different character arc for Gaara, in the very least in the way he turns out by the Boruto era. It doesn't even necessarily have to offset the power structure of the Biju, since with extended canon like the movie Bonds, we have substitutes we can use. Amaru and the Zero Tails very easily fit here, since it technically also only has one tail, and simply the act of canonizing and using a character in their lore like that alone would have interesting implications. And this is why stories like this, what if all Naruto filler and what if all Naruto movies were canon, are so high on my what if to-do list despite their tough structures. And the real intrigue here comes in finding out what Gaara's ultimate destiny will be in this story should it all happen. And that question goes for Shukaku as well, since we now know he has a very big personality. Would the words of Naruto still impact Gaara in the same way, and would he still choose the same path of Kazekage for himself in time skip? Do me a favor and subscribe, so you don't miss when I try and answer these questions. If either Kankuro, Temari, or both simultaneously were reborn with all their memories and powers, they'd actually have some real ability to shake up the early course of Naruto that even Gaara wasn't exactly privy to. First and foremost, this opportunity would simply just allow both to get stronger, especially Kankuro, since this is basically a chance to do what Sasori did, but better. And now he has all his knowledge of modern puppet craft and a younger body he can only make stronger, so in general, they can reach beyond their full potential and better stand by and protect Gaara from anything. They would also likely be able to put a stop to Orochimaru's machinations to involve them in the Leaf Crush, since I don't really see Temari having many intentions to change the course of her life, leading to starting a family with Shikamaru the Leaf. Also, interesting side note for this scenario and in canon, but I'm really ready to hear from Temari in the 2 Blue Vortex era. Anyway, they would therefore likely throw off a lot of the plans of the Serpent signing and the Chunin exams, possibly creating fairly big timeline changes for the main cast, and later, I could see them taking on and defeating the Akatsuki who come for Gaara, set them back as well. None of these changes seem extremely profound having done this so much, but even so, these things would likely mean the world for them and their family. If Rasa and the Kazekage in general were reborn is interesting, because outside of Gaara, every one of them met their end at the hand of an assassin, and even that exception almost didn't exist. So obviously, there will be goals like preventing their own deaths, and thus thwarting the so-called curse against the lineage of the Kazekage. But there would also be the maintained goal of continued betterment for the conditions of the people of the Hidden Sand. For instance, the first Kazekage, with a second go-round at the inaugural 5 Kage Summit, could be smarter about his bartering for fertile lands, and come out of it more successful in the Sand's agricultural exploits, because even though the Sand has little in terms of resources to trade, the land is good for harsh training and shinobi development, so simply casting the nation as more peaceful from the outset would be wise. And that way their land can be used as a neutral training ground, something the second Kazekage could see to. Meanwhile, the third foreseeing his death would also likely prevent the death of Sasori's parents and many others in the Second War. This would allow him further research into controlling Shukaku, likely seeing Sasori someday raise to the position of 4th Kazekage, where he would give Rasa more time and support to ensure Gaara is born safe and has a more perfect Jinchuriki as a result of all this. If the Tsuchikage were reborn with all their memories and powers, it would number 1, likely be an extremely in-depth and morally introspective story, as this setup is the most civilization, but in the world of Naruto which we've had in this SuperMini series yet, it would be kind of inherently political, more than most art of fiction usually is, and I find that super unique. And number 2, it would likely put Onoki and Kurotsuchi as our main characters at some setup, as they are drastically underutilized by the canon. A lot of the intrigue from such a scenario would come from interrogating the tough and unyielding will of stone, and how despite its merits and the evident pride and strength it brought to the people in Shinobi of the Land of Earth, it just as often threatened or even dragged the rest of the Shinobi world into harm due to a lack of understanding, too much isolationism, and over-militarization, bordering on the scarier ends of leadership, aka straight up fascism. It could even be argued that their push to that extreme began to push the other villages like the Leaf to the same, even in the world of Naruto, which is really saying something. Starting with the first, there really isn't that much that we need to change, since from what we can gather, Tsuchikage Ichikawa wasn't all too dissimilar from his grandson, the third Tsuchikage, and even encouraged him not to forsake break or distort his will in ninja way, as it would result in a life of excuses and hatred. In this timeline, he would be even more calm and noble, and he would likely not raise issue with the Sans demands at the first 5 Kage Summit. Instead, he would be more open to fostering trade deals, alliances, or solutions to issues and skirmishes over land and resources. Drawing on much of the context from the anime, Ishikawa could also find better fellowship with the Leaf through the Aburame clan, especially since he probably wouldn't hide his bug-tamer art from the rest of the Kamizuri clan and wider Hidden Stone village in this verse. This would of course influence Mui, the second Earth Shadow, who would too retain memories including his reincarnation in the Fourth War, and would then change the fate of Iwagakure even further. As in this timeline, it's highly likely he could just seek to avoid and ignore Madara's taunts with Onoki, instead trusting in the bond with Konoha, which he himself watched Ishikawa forge. And meanwhile, he would be focusing even more diligently on Onoki's training, as the two would at this point be united in their ideal that collectivist view of the other nations is what's best. This could in fact possibly even influence Madara's view of the nature of conflict in humanity, if only a little. And from there, as the third, Onoki would be on great terms and likely good friends with Hiruzen of the Leaf, and would even have his village participating in joint missions, as well as the tuning exams. What's more, the data of this timeline is likely better mentored, and even prepared to take up the mantle of the Force Uchikage to allow progress to roll more freely, if not explosively. And then finally, making her debut while participating in the tuning exams alongside Naruto, Kurotsuchi, now firmly determined to be the 5th Tsuchikage, would be stone cold set on protecting the world in the future, and creating bonds as well as fighting alongside her allies much sooner. I've said so countless times across this, Naruto characters reincarnated with all their powers and memory series, but this is a story we could really sink our teeth into. It's simply that meaty and has that much substance. It's something we're likely to have some spirited debate about, but also some amazing moments for an alternate timeline. So needless to say, look out for a mainline version of this scenario someday for sure, as we've barely scratched the surface, and this is just a super mini version of if either Yagura Karatachi or the Mizukage in general were reborn with their memories and powers. It would have the capability to be both an incredibly riveting story due to the potential it has to reshape the canon, but I'd go so far as to say it could also create an amazing AU for the shinobi world, which I would love to see explored officially by Kishimoto. The hidden miss since its introduction in the Land of Waves has always been an interesting village, ran in a let's say interesting way. My take on it always having been that it operates as nearly the exact moral opposite of the Leaf, hence backstories like Zabuza and Haku's. And the first to the third water shadows all have pretty big changes they could make, especially if the village doesn't go down the blood mist path, or its other self-detriments. Yagura, of course, more so than any can change the most interestingly, since he not only would have the imperative of stopping Madara, or I guess Toby, but also saving the Kekkei Genkai wielders of his land from genocide. And with the memories he'd have of meeting Naruto and the other Jinchuriki, he'd likely become a staunch advocate for their rights, which could see him become a compelling main character to follow in his own right, with a great cast supporting characters like his successors Mei and Chojuro, and would-be assassin Zabuza. If Rin no Hara was reborn with all her memories and powers, despite her place in the series as one of the most awkwardly written and executed characters, it would 100% create a branched timeline unrecognizable to the one we know of. First and foremost, despite her death coming before / kicking off so many pivotal moments for the series, Rin's conversation with Obito in the afterlife suggests she was actually able to watch over both he and Kakashi, and thus would know exactly how much pain and turmoil both went through going down their different paths. And that would be more than enough motivation to at least get stronger for this go around, and likely even throw a lot of that effort into training Obito up, so he can better keep up with his rifle and chase his own dream of becoming Hokage, the goal being for him to complete it this time. With just this and some foresight, Rin would be able to avoid capture, allowing Obito to avoid incapacitation, and thus his fate is Madara's proxy, and in the end, more than likely setting things up so Rin never receives the Three Tails. Though depending on how aggressive she wants to act in this timeline, taking steps to still be captured by the mist and turned into a tail beast time bomb may just be something she can twist to work in her favor in this timeline, maybe even awakening to a new power, capable of helping her protect everyone she loves. Certainly cliche, but no less impactful. If Fugaku Uchiha was reborn with all his memories and powers, he would have two possible routes he could go down. The first is he could be more fervent in his attempts to gain the position of Hokage following the Third Shinobi War, as this would ensure the Uchiha are never massacred by the village, with the quickest way being to perform acts of service, such as using his foreknowledge to oust Orochimaru, and to take on missions that otherwise ended in disaster, since he is aware of their pitfalls and can avoid them, turning him from Wicked Eye Fugaku to God Eye Fugaku for his seeming omniscience. The other option would be to avoid any attempt at gaining power at all, as that is what led to his clan's destruction, with him instead working to make sure the Uchiha as a whole are viewed more favorably, doing things such as defying orders to halt Kurama during the Nine-Tails attack, thus saving Lord Fourth and countless others, so that instead of being blamed as the cause of the attack, the Uchiha clan are heralded as its saviors. If Anko was reborn with all her memories and powers, she could have a far larger impact on the story than one would anticipate. First and foremost, all her powers mean she would be reborn with a curse mark, albeit an imperfect one, which would allow her to access a power that even Orochimaru himself at that point had not devised yet. This would make the girl even more interesting to him, ensuring she would become his student once again. Here, she would either be able to use that influence to steer her sensei away from his dark path, being aware of his crimes before they even happen, or else thwarting him by actively hampering his curse mark research, and possibly even turning him over to the village before he can amass the full extent of his power. However, Orochimaru is not the only villain Anko will be able to play a hand in preventing from rising to power, as it was she who found Obito's base in the lead up to the 4th Great Ninja War, meaning she could lead Konoha there as soon as Obito begins masquerading as Madara, thus catching him off guard and potentially preventing the Nine Tails attack, and possibly even the rise of the villainous iteration of the Akatsuki without Obito to guide Nagato, resulting in a very idealized timeline indeed. If Yamcha raised Goku is a pretty interesting scenario to me, though I know it likely won't be to a great deal of others. This is partially because I am definitely a bigger fan of the less impressive Dragon Ball characters most of the time, but also because I constantly try to recognize just how much those kinds of characters can do and become if the circumstances change just a bit. An initial idea that probably pops up from this idea is that Yamcha raising Goku would make him weaker, or the fact that Yamcha isn't really old enough to be a responsible guardian could be detrimental to Goku, but I think that ignores how mature and responsible Puar would be to balance the duo out. Beyond that, if you've seen my stories like Ken and Piccolo or Piccolo good early, you know I absolutely love these kind of brotherhood relationships in Dragon Ball, and so I can think of many ways to pay it off. Like for instance, in this timeline, Son Gohan will likely survive far longer than in canon, and with Yamcha's admiration of him, it's possible they could still wind up meeting with him, or even trying to rob him. I mention this because I also feel what if Grandpa raised Yamcha is just as interesting. Beyond this, Goku's mentality and fighting style will be different. He may be more willing to use whatever tactics are needed to win, while it's also quite possible he'd force Yamcha to get over his fear of women earlier, by getting Puar to help him learn to shapeshift as well, which in and of itself would make this Goku an extremely wacky and out-of-the-box fighter compared to many versions of himself in the multiverse. If Anin, the Supreme Elderly Lord, Keeper of the Furnace of 8 Divisions, and Queen of Mount 5 Element was canonically the mother of Chi-Chi and wife of Ox King, we'd legitimately be changing the entire course of Dragon Ball, without even dealing with any Saiyan or Namekian shenanigans yet, simply due to her effect on the overall power scale of the early franchise, as well as the fact that she'd likely position Chi-Chi as this scenario's point of view character, while her parents are likely the world's strongest for a very long time, since the goal could be for Chi-Chi to take over Anin's position eventually, which was a fairly high one in the realm of gods at this stage. And also, with all the info and demons we're learning about from Daima, it makes soul filler concepts like Anin, which are loosely tied to them, all the more interesting. There's also elements that could be explored with Anin's age and having a responsibility that forces one to grow older than the ones they love, which could be intriguing if a bit yikesy. Though considering all the methods of living a long life, you could easily adjust Ox King or Anin so we don't have a literal 10,000 year age gap. Regardless, you end up with a unique base premise that gives a lot to work with and shake up in the Dragon Ball timeline from an early point, hence why I grade it as such a great premise for an alternate universe of its own. If King Piccolo raised Goku, it would be as a result of major timeline divergences beforehand, and an out-of-character act of mercy, but regardless, will result in an interesting tale, as every day would be Piccolo and Goku Day. Firstly, this means Kami, Mutaito, and their disciples will likely be defeated and enslaved by the time Goku arrives, and secondly, Piccolo Daimao will be fully aware of the boy's alien origin in this timeline, likely intriguing him as to what's beyond the stars, and his own true nature. From here, because he is undeniably interesting, I think Goku will be kept as a sort of family pet that would slowly endear and earn his way to a position of general of the Demon King's horde of children, after proving his loyalty and helping to quell the last dregs of human resistance, in a truly twisted turn of his originally intended fate as a Saiyan warrior. So with Goku as his literal adopted son, probably with a name like Itar, King Piccolo will be pushed to live up to the example the boy sets, by going beyond and birthing a new generation of high potential demons for his heir to lead, and one day surpass him with, as they extend his reach into the galaxy, whilst terrifyingly conquering all who dare to oppose them, in their quest to grow ever stronger. If Krillin had joined Piccolo and Gohan for training, at the very least, it's safe to assume that the Saiyan saga would have went way easier for the Z fighters. First, there is the obvious benefit of an immediate, somewhat relevant training partner for Piccolo, and a softer and more familiar teacher for Gohan. But we should also keep in mind certain things like this trio's affinity for working with one another, that's later seen and expanded on by Filler in the Garlic Saga, as well as the fact that in the Saiyan saga, they were very much the last and most effective line of defense before Goku arrived, with the largest flaw in their plan simply being Gohan's confidence and lack of battle experience. But Krillin can kind of fix that in a lot of very simple ways, let alone doing more elaborate stuff like getting Piccolo to start Gohan off with meditation and image training, before then putting him on an exercise regimen with weighted gear, while the two of them spar rematches of their 23rd World Tournament match. That way he gets toughened up in a more hands-on way, while they constantly ramp up their own power and strategic arsenal by training as the two craftiest brainiacs the heroes have to offer. Which also means this version of Gohan would more than likely gain some confidence earlier, but also a balance of his brains and bronze faster, even if their power levels may only get a small jump from this change when being generous. Their increased coordination and trust would turn them into a nightmare for the Saiyans. If Krillin had somehow met and trained with King Kai before the start of Z, just like with Goku or any other character, it would have the possibility to change the timeline to something near unrecognizable, and would probably make a lot more characters more relevant and helpful for longer. The key issue here is that people killed by the Demon Clan actually didn't wind up in the afterlife until Junior's change of heart in Z, so already changes would have to take place to even give Krillin the chance. But an easy answer would be to have his prior fights with Chaozu especially, but then after Goku be more intense, so he's in worse shape and has injuries he could succumb to before Tambourine finishes him off. The second issue issue is how long it'd take Krillin to cross Snake Way, as he'd likely need the entire 8 years before Z, or more. But if he relies on his wit and humor with the help of Kami, he could establish himself as such a good comedian that King Kai might be willing to drive out to pick him up and train him, with the two forming a strong bond of master and disciple even past his revival after King Piccolo's defeat, with Krillin spending his entire time skip there before returning with a power boost that allows him to take down Ma Jr. and rematch Goku, changing the timeline immensely from the earlier power creep, and an intro of a limit-breaking technique by one often overlooked. Laser Breaker 4758 had an extremely interesting idea, which also wound up being unique. And while I'm not sure if the concept truly is worth a scenario all its own, this notion of basically making Kaioken more like Ultra Instinct or Ego, where it can be considered a form just as much as a technique, is a really alluring one to me, because it already feels damn near rooted in canon mechanics. Firstly, because Kaioken is already a divine technique, even if Goku was the first to truly push the technique to higher limits. But also because in that divine origin, one has to wonder if there is a possible right way to use the Kaioken at higher levels, as opposed to the very much wrong one Whis noted when it was used in the manga version of the TOP, for example. Something better than being able to stack it on another form, something like an Ultra form all its own, on the same playing field as Instinct and Ego. It's a concept I definitely want to explore more in stories like Bardock's family and Human Saiyans, since in my opinion, we've reached the point for new forms of divinity to be manifested as mortals are already surpassing gods. What about an Ultra awareness for abilities like that of Tien or Granola, or even an Ultra optimization to bring this idea from Laser Breaker of truly mastering divine Kaioken to life? If Bardock was Vegeta's guardian and trainer, it would be something of an upset in Saiyan society to have a low-class warrior entrusted with the prince's security, though thanks to his power level of 10,000, this would be a merited position, garnered the results. Thanks to this, Bardock would be placed on the same squad as Raditz, meaning they would have further time to bond, at least to the degree that Saiyan fathers and sons do, with his pride in his lineage seeing Bardock put some effort into the boy, so that while he is still weaker than Vegeta, who is his primary charge, he is not Raditz the Runt, meaning he is treated less coldly by his squad mates. One unfortunate consequence of Bardock being posted on Vegeta's squad is that at the prince's direction, he would not be present on planet Vegeta during its destruction, meaning Gina and Kakarot both perished with no forewarning. Following this, Bardock, along with his students and comrades, would be placed under the direct service of Lord Frieza, an odious prospect that the Scarred Saiyan would chafe under. Though being a tactical man, and one who is loyal to his squad mates, he would ensure that the additional members of Vegeta's team seen in the Broly flashback do not die, but instead grow stronger alongside himself, Vegeta, and Raditz. They can act on Bardock's suspicions and avenge their race by toppling the tyrant and the entire empire that kept them under boot for so long. If Vegeta had the potential of Frieza's wicked bloodline, is to me a much more interesting prompt for this format than for Goku, though I've definitely never seen every what if ever made for any story no matter how popular. That said, one thing I think we're all very familiar with is the fan animation Legend, which features a retelling of the 2013 Tenkaichi Budokai arc, replacing Piccolo Jr. with Broly, and seeing Vegeta introduced early in an already heroic role, alongside Super Saiyan to boot. IMO, this premise is a great skeleton to base the scenario off, since the way the fan animation begins and ends off is very open-ended, and one can interpret things in many different ways, even if you didn't want to take the broad strokes from Legend. I do think at least his characterization of the Saiyan monarchy and what it means to Vegeta should stay, since it grounds us to recognizing him, even in a different verse or interpretation. The most interesting part of the question is certainly how young Vegeta chooses to use all that awesome power and potential, and how figures like King Cold, King Vegeta, Frieza, and Nappa react to and try to manipulate that power for their own game. Needless to say, this is just my dipping a toe into the topic, so you guys know I'll be back for a full story someday, so subscribe to not miss out on that. If Bardock and King Vegeta turned Super Saiyan, it'd quite easily change the course of the entire world of Dragon Ball far before Prince Vegeta and Son Goku, or rather Kakarot, would be ready to take its stage. Interestingly, both characters have high-stress experiences that take place close to the Saiyan extermination across multiple interpretations, with the loss of Bardock's team and the King's final stand against Frieza. However, with Super, there's an amazing opportunity created by the Heaters, as the battle with Berserk Gas would be more logical with Super Saiyan allowing Bardock to destroy the Brokers and return home to plot a rebellion, having been radicalized by Planet Cereal. Meanwhile, the king could have his awakening in a similar moment of shame to his sons, possibly whilst having been defeated, left for dead, or on the verge of it by Frieza. Due to the strings of fate tying them as legends, and Bardock's machinations, I'm sure the two would come to meet, even if Bardock has to save the king by force and nurse him back to health alongside Gina to join his campaign. However, as is the nature of the family, the king would accept no equal, and so first, the battle between them must be distinguished. Some may look to power levels, the Saiyan caste system, or the merit of consistent experience in the battlefield to gauge the winner of this clash, but the result for the Empire would be the same. If Son Goku was betrayed and trapped in the demon realm, it's certainly a scenario which may initially seem more for the memes than anything, but it's not exactly 100% far-fetched, since there are actually opportunities for this to happen, and change the timeline immensely. And with Daima, the concept will only become more interesting with the more lore and info we get. For instance, while I think doing so as early as possible is more interesting, one way this could take place is through one of the Piccolos being trapped alongside Goku by Kami, under the misunderstanding that they both have a seemingly inherently evil demonic nature, and would fit right in, which to be fair, they kind of would. Or, this could happen when Goku faces Dark darkness after ingesting the Ultra Divine Water. More interesting though becomes the question of what mentors, friends, masters, and companions Goku would run into and make in the Demon Realm, and how they would change him as a warrior and a person. Maybe he meets Glorio and Pansy early, or even joins up with Shura, Mera, and Gora from the original filler about the Demon Realm in Dragon Ball, or perhaps King Dabura, another member of the demonic royal family, perhaps even the likes of Toa and Mira, or hell, Beelzebub from Sandland. Eventually though, Goku would likely escape from the Demon Realm, whether with the Dragon Balls or through Warp Sama, so the intrigue stems from what exactly he'd do now that he's back.